and welcome to this Ignite webcast. I see a lot of familiar names and a lot of new ones. So my name is Josh Topel, and I'm a program manager for Office 365. And Ignite events are a series of technical workshops for IT professionals and Microsoft partners. The Ignite webcast series will address different technical subjects and scenarios that are beneficial to anyone who wants to increase their knowledge of the Office 365 suite. And today we're happy to welcome back Daniel Kenyon-Smith as our presenter. Daniel will use our latest Ignite webcast to discuss hybrid deployment. Again, Daniel is an Office 365 architect joining us from the UK, and today's session provides a great opportunity to hear directly from a Microsoft employee and learn about some of the new features and releases for Office 365. So today's webcast will be an hour, and we'll leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end to field questions from anyone on the call. So I ask that you please hold your questions till the end, and then we'll have that Q&A portion. And you can go ahead and type those questions into the link chat box, and we'll try to get to all of them. And if we can't, we'll follow up through email afterwards, and I'll let you know how that'll work. One last thing is that we are recording today's session, and we'll have the slideshow presentation and the video recording online, and you can find that on the Office 365 community blog and on the Office 365 YouTube channel. And those links are right there, pasted into the chat box. So that's it for me, and Daniel, whenever you're ready.
Excellent. Thanks, Josh. So welcome everybody. Thanks for taking the time to attend this session. And what we're going to look at here is hybrid deployments, essentially Exchange hybrid deployments. So the agenda, we're going to have a look at some of the hybrid coexistence features, some of the planning and deployment, and some of the infrastructure and architecture required to move or implement hybrid and move mailboxes to Office 365. So there's a summary of some of the migration options here. So we did run a session last week with regards to IMAP cutover and some staged migrations. So if you want to know about those in a little bit more detail, then just go to the links that Josh posted up there, and you'll be able to get the session from last week that we ran for those particular migrations. So just quickly an overview for those. So an IMAP migration is so you can move to Office 365 from IMAP-based solutions, or it could be another cloud-hosted solution. We've got a cutover Exchange migration, which is essentially a fast cutover where you would cut over up to 1,000 mailboxes in one go, essentially, to Office 365. And then you've got a slightly more measured approach if you use the staged migration, where we implement directory sync. Directory sync will then synchronize on-premise AD, for example, up to Office 365, and then we can just select which mailboxes we want to migrate by loading those into a CSV and just loading those specific mailboxes. So obviously the bulk of this particular presentation is going to be around the hybrid. So obviously hybrid is a more measured approach for moving to Office 365. And again, depending on business requirements, depends on whether it would be a hybrid or whether it would be one of the other sort of simple migrations. But from a hybrid perspective, it'll give us much more rich coexistence. It's essentially designed for a gradual or permanent migration up to Office 365. And it gives us some more advanced features and capabilities than we get from the simple migrations, so such as calendar sharing and free busy between a user that's in Office 365 and a user that's on premise. And essentially we have a hybrid server, which may be sort of a dedicated server, or it could actually be a server that you've already got that's been used for on-premise infrastructure, and that depends on what version you've got. So essentially for a hybrid server, we would either require an Exchange 2010 server or an Exchange 2013 server. So in this presentation, we will mainly talk about Exchange 2013, but of course there are still some references to Exchange 2010 where we can provide hybrid, assuming that you've got at least SP2. So we can see on the right-hand side on the table that we've got here that we can provide hybrid from Exchange 2010, and For Exchange 2010, and we'll cover this in a little bit more detail, depends on the service pack. If you want to connect to the Office 365, which has been released now, so that the new version, i.e. the sort of Wave 15 version, then you would require Exchange 2010 SP3, or you can implement hybrid for Exchange 2013. So there's a couple of options there, and we'll delve into those in a little bit more detail as we push through. So some of the benefits then around hybrid. So as we've said, it's really an extension to your on-premise infrastructure. So it's basically making your on-premise and cloud organizations work together seamlessly between a user that's in Office 365 and another user that's on-premise. So as we've said, we can view things like calendar details, free busy, as if we would if we were sat next to each other or on the same Exchange server on-premise. So we get pretty much near parity and features between on-premise and the cloud. So like I say, we get, by running hybrid, we can get full mail flow, we get, the rich authentication, so we can view contacts within inside the global address list, and we'll be able to see full details within inside those contacts. And again, we'll cover that in the next few slides. So again, seamless interaction. So in theory, a user shouldn't really notice whether they're in Office 365 or on-premise. So you migrate the mailbox, and the user will log in. There's a slight change to the Outlook profile, and again, we'll cover that. But essentially, the user, won't know whether they're in the cloud or whether they're actually on-premise. So again, the migrations themselves. So we'll talk a little bit about the migrations, and we've got a couple of slides towards the back end of the presentation that talks around some additional considerations to ensuring that we get smooth transitions for A, setting up hybrid, and B, for being able to use the migration tools that we've got for migrating the mailboxes from on-premise up to Office 365. So some of the key benefits and features, I guess, of hybrid are essentially these pillars that we've got on here. And one of those is around the Federation Trust. So the Federation Trust itself provides delegated authentication between on-premise and cloud web services. So that basically means that when you submit a free busy request, you're essentially submitting that to the CAS server or the client access server on-premise, for example, if your mailbox is on-premise. So if we were to run through a quick example, if you're a user that's on-premise and we've got one user that's been migrated up to Office 365, and I'm on-premise, I open up my Outlook client or I use OA, and I essentially want to request a free busy, details of that person that's in the cloud. What I'll essentially do is connect to my on-premise CAS, which will then in turn talk to the client access server in Exchange Online. And that's basically the delegated authentication where the CAS is acting on that user's behalf. And it's the Federation Trust technology that works in the background to be able to enable that. The Federation Trust is also what enables the free busy, the calendar sharing. And we can also do things like message tracking. We can create things like the online archive. So we could essentially have a mailbox on premise with an online archive. And the Federation Trust does a whole lot more than that as well. And that's all run through the Microsoft Federation Gateway. One of the other pieces that we've improved is the integrated admin experience. So in Exchange 2010, we manage Exchange through the Exchange Management Console, and we used to add in the Office 365 remote Exchange organization into that console. So now we use the Exchange Admin Center, which is what we get with Exchange 2013, and that allows us to be able to manage and configure both on-prem and cloud from one central location. So that's the EAC, the Exchange Admin Center. We can also provide native mailbox moves. So if you've got a user that's on, let's say, Exchange 2007 with the latest Service Pack 3, and or a mailbox on Exchange 2010, again with either SP2 or SP3, then we can do an online move. So essentially we can move that mailbox up to Office 365 whilst that user's still logged into that mailbox. The only time it would be an offline move is if you're moving from an Exchange 2003 server. But there's some considerations around Exchange 2003 in that if we wanted to implement an on-premise Exchange 2013, then we only support Exchange 2007 as a minimum version of Exchange. So if we put in Exchange 2013, we couldn't have, and we have no support for Exchange 2003 in the same Exchange org. So if you do want to support Exchange 2003 and move those mailboxes to the cloud, you would need to have Exchange 2010 and then the SP3 service pack to connect to the latest version of Office 365. So one thing that we do is when we do the mailbox migration, we leverage something called MRS, which is essentially the mailbox replication service. And what that does is that allows us to then be able to do move requests and move those mailboxes from on-prem to Office 365. And it would preserve the OST file, so it'll essentially move the mailbox GUID up to Office 365, so there's no OST sync or download or recreation of profiles, and it's just a redirection of the existing profile. So with the simple migrations that we talked about last week, we did end up creating a brand new mailbox in Office 365, therefore the user had to create a new profile and download the OSTs. That's not the case with the hybrid migration. That mailbox GUID moves and it just does a redirect. And we'll have a look at a slide as to exactly what the client does and how it works out, exactly where that mailbox is once you've moved it to Office 365. And we also have secure mail flow. So secure mail flow is enabled by default when we run the hybrid configuration wizard. And of course we don't think it's a good idea to deploy hybrid without securing mail between on-prem and Office 365. So because it's enabled by default, obviously any email that's sent between on-premise and Office 365 is encrypted and both parties are mutually authenticated. Essentially, if you disabled the secure mail, then you'd be basically sending email between people that are on-premise and people that are in Office 365, essentially over the internet that's not encrypted. So obviously we recommend that we just leave that with the default configuration of TLS essentially between Office 365 and on-premise. So when we talk about Office 365, there's obviously a sort of front end to Office 365, which is Forefront Online Protection for Exchange, FOPI, or what's now called the newer version, which is Exchange Online Protection, so EOP. But one of the things that we also do around the secure mail piece is we preserve all the internal message headers. So basically an email looks like it's come from somebody within inside the business, although of course we know that we've got the on-premise Exchange organization and Office 365 Exchange organization, i.e. two separate Exchange organizations, but the hybrid configuration wizard will ensure that we preserve all the message headers so it looks like it's come from somebody that was inside the same Exchange organization. And then one of the sort of final pieces that we support around compliance is some of the mail flow scenarios. So we've got some slides again that talk a little bit more about the central transport, which is essentially enforcing all mail to come in and out of your organisation, regardless of whether you're in Office 365 or not. But we'll come to that later. Slide was just a little bit slow there. So these are some of the main features then between a simple migration, which again is the session that we ran before, and obviously what we get with a hybrid migration. So of course we can route mail between on-premise and cloud. We can have a shared namespace, so we can have a user on-premise and a user in the cloud that's both got user at company.com, for example. So shared namespace. We've obviously got the unified GAL, and that's provided by the directory sync tool. So we covered briefly the directory sync tool on the identities session that we ran a few weeks ago, but we do have a dedicated session on directory sync coming up next week. Obviously, we get as we mentioned, we get free busy and calendar sharing between somebody in Office 365 and somebody on premise. We've got some screenshots to show you shortly. We've got things like out of office, so we can understand things between the internal setting that you can do for out of office. As well, the hybrid wizard will configure all the mail tips and message tracking to work cross premises. So again, somebody in the cloud, somebody in Office 365. We've got things like OA redirection as well. So you've got a single URL for both on-premise and cloud. Single migration tool. So again, we'll show you a quick screenshot of where you would run the migration tool from, but it's the same location as where we would run the IMAP staged and cutover migrations as well. So again, all in the same location. We can support things like onboarding and offboarding. So obviously when we talk about onboarding, it's a move to Office 365, and we said that we preserve the Mailbox GUID, and therefore you don't need to download the OST. And depending on where the mailbox is on premise, depends on whether it be an online or an offline move. And we also provide offboarding, i.e. we can migrate back from Office 365 back to on-premise, again preserving the OST. So there may just be one specific business requirement or something that requires one user also to be able to move on premise, but we do support that. So as we said, there's no reconfiguration of the client. So essentially all the user will see is that the administrator has made a change. Please restart Outlook, and then you will restart Outlook, and then a process will kick in, which again we'll cover in a few slides. As we said, we preserve things like the message headers, so it looks like it's come from an internal recipient. So if I receive an email from somebody external, then of course it just shows me the full SMTP address. If I receive an email from somebody internally, then I can double click on that name that's being resolved, and I can see the full contact cards, their details, phone numbers, or whatever's been populated in that in the address list. So we preserve all of that as well, obviously regardless of whether you're in the cloud or whether you're on premise. And as we said, we've also got this centralized mail flow, so we can enforce all mail that comes in through your organization, hits sort of on premise, and then redirects up to Office 365, and then somebody that's in Office 365 would route their mail all the way back down on premise, and then out through the cloud if you choose to do so. But that's not the default configuration, but again we'll cover that in a few more slides. So this is just an example of the screenshot really of the cross-premise free busy calendar sharing. So look and feel of a single organization essentially, and that will work with any of the supported Outlook clients. So at the moment the minimum supported Outlook client is actually Outlook 2003, but that's only supported for IMAP and POP. Obviously to get the full RPC over HTTPS Outlook Anywhere connection, then you'd be looking at Outlook 2007 as a minimum currently. And the bottom screenshot is showing us there that we can view the free busy, although actually I think in that instance no one's got anything in the calendar. It's not showing the unavailable access, so we can actually see that we have got the free busy between somebody in the cloud and somebody on-prem. Same sort of thing for the message tips. So again, the mail tips, it'll look at the evaluation of an internal versus external, and essentially you would be able to see the message tips or somebody that is inside the organization. The screenshot at the top is obviously saying this person outside, and obviously when we run the hybrid, then in the background hybrid actually runs quite a lot of commands. Before we had the hybrid configuration wizard, it was around about 60, 70 or 180 commandlets and various other things that needed to be done in order to configure hybrid. So now we just use the wizard, and that will essentially do all of those in the background by using PowerShell. And some of the things that it does do is obviously configure the mail tips, so you don't get those messages to say that you're from the outside of the organization when obviously you're not, you're actually both internal users. And as we said, for Mailflow as well, so the authentication, so we know that it's from a trusted internal user. So as I say, if I was to receive an email from somebody that's externally outside of my organization, I would get the screenshot that we've got at the top. And then obviously once I run hybrid, again, configure all the mail routing and all the commandlets that run in the background, then essentially I double click on that particular person's contact. Because we've got the authentication, it's trusted, I would therefore be able to read the information that's inside the GAL.
Daniel, I think we lost your audio.
Yeah, can you hear?
Yep, now I can hear you. Thanks.
Yeah. Looks like links. I've got the little donut on there. Actually, I can't seem to switch over the slides. I don't know whether you can switch the slides at all. Although, it's kicked back in. Okay. Yeah. Okay, that's all right. Has that moved over?
Yep. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Right. There we go. Sorry. Right. Okay. So some of the hybrid features. So again, making sure that it's a seamless organization, as we said, between somebody on-prem and somebody in the cloud. Seamless interaction between the on-premise mailboxes, and as we've said, we can migrate or onboard and offboard mailboxes to Office 365. So some of the requirements then, so for, as we said, this is specifically talking about 2013 hybrid requirements. So we would require the Exchange 2013 client access role and the mailbox role server on premise. Some of the sort of prerequisites actually before we jump into that is we require DIRSync, so directory sync is required for us to run hybrid. As we said, we need the 2013 CAS mailbox or a 2010 SP3 server to connect to the current version of Office 365. And then some of the options that we have that are not so required are things like the ADFS, so the Active Directory Federation Services. So strictly speaking, it's not required, but of course we recommend that you deploy ADFS, the single sign-on, for the rich integrated experience for accessing your mail. So essentially, we're not having a double identity, one in the cloud and one on-prem. So by having ADFS, we essentially get that single identity. So Exchange. So we need the Exchange 2013. So we need the CU1 update in order to connect to the WAF 15 tenant. And obviously, with hybrid in place, it will run all of these commands in the background, as we've said. Connecting to Office 365, it will create that Federation Trust, and that's using the MFG, which is Microsoft Federation Gateway. We need to put all our certificates in place, and we'll talk about some of the prerequisites. But essentially, we need to have some certificates, public-facing certificates, in order to do that TLS connection between on-premise and Office 365. We also recommend, obviously, that you register all of your SMTP domain names. So, as we said, we can have a user@company.com and on-premise and in the cloud. So, in order for us to be able to do that, we would need to register, add, verify, and register those domains in Office 365. So, obviously, they're available when we migrate the mailbox. And as we said, the directory sync tool is a hard requirement in order to run hybrid. So some of the limitations. So this is for Exchange 2013 hybrids. So, and this essentially is the same for on-premise. So if you wanted to install Exchange 2013 on-premise, then there is no support for Exchange 2003. The minimum version of Exchange is 2007. So if you do have Exchange 2003, and again we've got a slide covering this later, but if you do have Exchange 2003 and you do want to run hybrid and you do want to connect to the latest version of Office 365, then Exchange 2010 requires SP3. So there's the delegation coexistence between on-premise. So essentially things like your send as and full permissions and any delegations are migrated with you when you migrate from on-premise to Office 365. But currently we don't support that cross-forest delegation. So if you have somebody such as a manager and a secretary, for example, then you would move both of those people together and it would maintain that delegated permission access as you move both of those users in the same batch. So the hybrid experience, so again, if we've configured the single sign-on or the single identities, the ADFS piece, Active Directory Federation Services, then the user would log on with their Active Directory credentials, and there's no need obviously to distribute new passwords. So essentially we can put directory sync in, ADFS, run hybrid, and we can move a user's mailbox to Office 365. They would use the same identity as what they have on premise. The only slight difference is that when you log on to Office 365, you need to enter your UPN, so your user principal name, which may be slightly different to how a user would access their local resources now. So that just may be some information they need to pass in the communications that you send to the users as you start to schedule their migrations. So we've got a slide coming up around AutoDiscover, so we'll come back to that one. We've talked about the OST, so you don't have to recreate those. And as we said, the admin will, the user will see that your administrator has made a change to your Outlook client. So just close and reopen Outlook, and then it will do that re-auto-discover process when it realizes that your mailbox is no longer on premise and has actually moved to Office 365. So this is the auto-discover process. So we have, in this instance, moved the user's on-premise mailbox up to Office 365. We've got directory sync in place, and as we've done this remote move, we've essentially moved the mailbox up to Office 365 using the Mailbox replication service, the MRS. And we've updated the on-premise object to reflect that the user is no longer has a mailbox on-premise, and mailbox is actually located elsewhere. So we can see on the left-hand side in the on-premise blue side that essentially they have a remote routing address, a target address essentially, that says it's user at contoso.mail.onmicrosoft.com. So that's essentially the internal routing domain, and this is all transparent as far as the user is concerned. This is kind of what's going on in the background. But Contoso, that's the name of the tenant, so that would be tenantname.mail.onmicrosoft.com. And as I said, the mail.onmicrosoft.com is what's used for this internal routing domain. So my client will essentially either log in the following morning or be asked to restart their Outlook client. It will connect to on-premise, which is where it thinks its mailbox is. And essentially will be returned to say that actually your mailbox is no longer located here, and this is based on what's in the target address. And it'll actually say that your mailbox is located at tenantname.mail.onmicrosoft.com. So as we know, the Outlook client itself will then try and do an auto-discover. So it will do auto-discover.contoso.mail.onmicrosoft.com, and those DNS records will already be provisioned and created for you, which is one of those commands that you used to have to do manually before we came around to the hybrid configuration wizard. So essentially, the Outlook client will re-auto-discover up to Office 365, and it will be the Outlook client will then, as a sort of a one-time only, unless your password changes, would then be prompted for your UPN. So in the background, and we talked about this in the identities session that we ran a few weeks ago, what the process would be and the different endpoints with inside Office 365. But essentially you type in your UPN and password, and then that would go through the whole authentication process in the background through ADFS. Once you typed in your details, and obviously that had been verified and the tokens had been passed around with inside ADFS and Office 365, then you would connect to your mailbox in Exchange Online. So it'll pass you the information as to where your mailbox server is, and essentially update the Outlook profile. So it just does that sort of re-auto-discover piece as opposed to recreating any new profiles. So that's just a sort of a process that goes on in the background. So some of the improvements that we've made specifically for 2013. So essentially what we do now is as we run through the wizard, we would input details, and then depending on how you respond to those questions depends on what else you would be prompted for as you move through that wizard, and then it will automatically gather all of that information in the background wherever possible. We've also got integrated support for Edge server. So in the previous hybrid configuration wizard, i.e. Exchange 2010 SP2, we had no support for Edge transport server. So we can now route emails using Edge transport directly up into Office 365. And one thing that we do require is the FOPI or EOP to be able to access your Exchange servers directly. So essentially we can't have any other sort of third-party solutions sitting in between Office 365 or FOPI and your Exchange servers, because if we have anything sitting in there, then there's a chance that they would move the message headers and break some of that fidelity that we've been talking about. So one option is to obviously put an Edge transport server in, and then obviously the Edge transport server will be sat in the DMZ, and then that can talk directly to your Office 365 FOPI servers. Okay, so one of the other ones is around the secure mail. So in Exchange 2010, we used IPs to select the correct connector. So it meant that you had to manage static IPs on your connectors, which was typically problematic. So now, instead of using the IPs, we actually use certificates for the mail flows on those connectors. So that removes some of that, some of those issues. So some of the other pieces then. So again, the EOP connections and internet mail routing. So we now support, so essentially when you run the hybrid configuration wizard, we specify the domain name or the domain names that we want to be part of hybrid, and that now means that you can move your MX records whenever you want. You don't have to move them at the beginning. You can move those at the beginning, end, or after you've run the hybrid configuration wizard now, so you can point that MX record to Office 365 at any point during your migration. We've also got some improved centralized support. So as we've said now, what we can do is we can essentially either have all mail come through your existing MX records that point to your on-premise organization into your Exchange organization, and then route to Office 365. Anybody that's in Office 365 that wants to email somebody on the internet, we can, by using a centralized support, route that mail back down to on-premise and then back out through the internet. Or obviously the preference will be for that user to email somebody directly on the internet out through Office 365 and not come back in through your on-premise infrastructure. The reason why you might want to route your mail back through your on-premise infrastructure is just if you're doing any form of data leakage protection, or you're doing address rewriting on-premise, for example. As we've said, we've got the move mailbox wizard, so we can use the wizard to essentially move the mailboxes, and we can also use PowerShell as well. So we can use remote PowerShell to run the migrations. So high-level sort of architecture. So the on-premise Exchange organization would have things like directory syncing. As we said, that's a prerequisite, and obviously that will sync users, groups, and contacts up to Office 365 to give us that unified GAL. We said we would have secure mail, so we would use TLS between on-premise and Office 365, and that communication would need to be direct. So whether that's direct with the Exchange 2013 servers, or whether that's the Edge Transport server. By running the hybrid wizard, it will create the Federation Trust to allow us to have things like the FreeBusy and mail tips, and the mailbox data would actually be moved by using the MRS, which is essentially means you need to publish Exchange Web Services externally, assign a name, so that could be migration.company.com, publish those records externally, publish EWS, and I've got some links later on that talk you through how you can publish your hybrid servers to the internet, so which URLs you would need to publish through something like TMG, for example. So this particular scenario here for the hybrid deployment, so this is from 2007 or 2010 environment, which has got no Edge Transport server. So we run the latest service packs. So that would be Exchange 2007 SP3, I think that's at IU10, and Exchange 2010 SP3. So we would update the internet-facing site and the intranet like we would normally if you were doing an on-premise upgrade from 2007 to 2010, for example. We can then deploy our Mailbox and CAS servers if we were also implementing Exchange 2013. Set all of our external URLs, EWS services, so configure the on-premise virtual directories, obtain your certificates and public-facing certificates and load those onto the Mailbox and CAS servers. So that would be to allow us to again create that secure TLS to Office 365 for secure mail. We would then publish the protocols externally, so create your DNS records for EWS and your SMTP endpoints out on the internet, and of course we can use the remote connectivity analyzer to ensure that we can connect in and everything is working as expected. Because essentially if we have something that's blocking the authentication, for example, maybe a firewall, then of course the migration itself will fail. But obviously the remote connectivity analyzer will tell us that before we start to attempt to running any migrations. And then we can switch over the namespaces. So again, typical sort of on-premise setup where we would point all our external namespaces to the latest version of Exchange. Then we can run the hybrid configuration wizard to connect the on-premise organization to Office 365, and then we can start to use the PowerShell or the Exchange admin console to be able to migrate those mailboxes to Office 365. This is a similar sort of scenario, but in this instance we've got Edge Transport. So the previous version, the previous demo, we didn't have Edge Transport. In this we do have Edge Transport, so it's pretty much the same sort of process. So we run through, update all the service packs, install the CAS and Mailbox server, the Edge 2010 server, obtain your certificates. So notice that we have to use Edge 2010 servers, so we don't have an Edge 2013 server currently. So we do support Edge 2010 with the 2013 servers. Load the certificates on there, on all of those servers. Again, create the DNS records externally for EWS and your SMTP. Again, test using the remote connectivity analyzer. Switch over your records. Run the hybrid configuration wizard. And again, start to move your mailboxes. So essentially the same sort of process. Apart from this, has just got Edge in, which means that you just need to put the certificates on Edge. Okay, so in this slide then, so this is just running through the hybrid configuration wizard. So you can run the hybrid configuration wizard from the Exchange admin console on premise. So what you should see is like an enterprise tab, and also an Office 365 tab, but the enterprise tab would be managing your on-premise, and then you can select hybrid down the bottom where you would start to enable hybrid. There's essentially two parts to hybrid. One is where we create the container for hybrid, and then we essentially configure that container, which is like the second part of the hybrid configuration. So we have the container, and then we pass all the information that we've collected over to the configuration engine, which essentially then starts to run those PowerShell commands in the background and configures hybrid as we've specified in the wizard. So if it's a new deployment, it will create all the new relevant objects. But if it's an existing deployment, then it'll simply just look at all the differences. So confirm that we want to run the hybrid configuration wizard. Select the domains that we want to be part of hybrid. Again, we'd register those in Office 365 as well. We still, and this is the same as the hybrid configuration wizard for 2010, we'd still need to create the DNS records to prove that we own the domains, so creating the proof records. And then we get to the transport options on here. So this is where we can specify that we want to use things like the client access and mailbox servers for secure mail to Office 365, or actually whether we want to select the edge transport service. And down the bottom we can see we've got the enable centralized mail transport. So essentially, unless you have a specific requirement, like I say, for something like a DLP or address rewriting, then we don't recommend that you enable centralized mail transport. And as we said, centralized mail transport, if you enable that, would essentially mean that all mail would go through on-premise, both in and out of Office 365. So it would create some connectors in Exchange Online Protection or FOPI, which is basically star. So all emails that come from a user in Office 365 would hit that star.star connector, which would then route that mail back through on-premise. If you were doing address rewriting or a DLP, it would do whatever the requirement for having the centralized mail flow, and then it would go out through your existing gateways. If you don't enable centralized mail transport, then when you send an email from Office 365, that email will go directly from Office 365 and obviously not route back through on-prem, because obviously if you do route that back through on-prem, then you're just adding additional hops and causing more complexity. So our recommendation would not to be enable centralized transport unless there's a specific requirement to do so. And then what we do is we select the CAS servers. So for Exchange 2013, we select the Exchange 2013 CAS server. They are essentially the receiving servers from Office 365. And we need to select the Mailbox server because they'll be the servers that will be the sending servers from on-premise to Office 365. Then you specify which certificate. So as we said, we've uploaded the certificates on the relevant servers, so that could be Edge, Mailbox, or CAS. That's the certificate. Specify the external FQDN, so that will be the name that we essentially want to connect to from Office 365, so that's the name that's in the certificates for connecting to Office 365 or FOPI or Exchange Online Protection. You also need to have the relevant permissions, of course. So, oops, I don't know what happened there. I'll just work through that. So you obviously need to have the relevant permissions. So you need to have the Exchange organization management on-premise, and you also need to have the relevant global admin permissions in Office 365. So you need to specify both of those permissions as you go through the wizard. So that would be collecting all of the data, and then essentially we would pass that information over then to the configuration engine, which then starts to load all of that and runs all the PowerShell scripts in the background and essentially starts to configure hybrid. So as we talk about the tenant compatibility, Exchange 2013 only supports, it says the next version of Office 365, but that's the current version of Office 365. So we've obviously now gone to general availability for the new version of Office 365. So if you was to create a new tenant now, you would be creating a new Wave 15 or Exchange 2013 tenant. So if you want to run hybrid with Exchange 2013, it will only support the current version, so it won't support the previous version, which is like Wave 14, i.e. Exchange 2010 that's in the cloud. If you've got if you created a tenant, let's say 6 months ago, and you essentially have one of the now older tenants running the older version of Exchange, i.e. Exchange 2010, then so essentially you would have to go through a update process from your current version to the new version. So you'd receive some emails to say that we're going to upgrade your tenant, and you get some information about that. But essentially you won't be able to run an Exchange 2013 hybrid until that tenant has been fully upgraded. So you can be in a state where you get some emails through and you can pilot up to 100 users before you actually go ahead with the full migration. So until that's been fully upgraded, you won't be able to run Exchange 2013. What we do is we do some tenant checks to see what version of your tenant you've got when you try and run the hybrid configuration wizard from Exchange 2013. It looks like the link is playing up again. Yeah, so I think link's playing up a little bit there, so that's not allowing me to move the slide across.
Do you need the next slide?
Yeah, I don't know whether can you move the next slide?
Is that it? Exchange 2010 hybrid support.
Yeah, it might be. It's probably me. I think it's my client. I can't see that, so I probably can't. Assuming everybody else can see that slide that you've moved across. Should we just check that other people can see it, and then we'll crack on?
No, other people are on 21. Okay. Let's see.
You might need to take over as presenter, I think.
Alright.
Oh, okay, I think mine's kicked back in. Yeah.
Okay, I took over as presenter, so just let me know and I'll change the slide.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so for 2010 hybrid support, we require ASP3 in order to connect to the new and current Office 365 tenants. So Exchange 2010 will obviously still support Exchange 2003 with the new tenant. So if you have Exchange 2003 and you want to move to the new version of Office 365, the only way you can do that is through Exchange 2010 SP3. Okay, next slide. So the deployment process, so this looks fairly simple. So we would just create the Office 365 tenant, register all of your domain names, as we said, the prerequisite task for running directory sync, install your on-premise Mailbox CAS servers and maybe Edge if you require, and then publish all of your endpoints, so things like your EWS, any AutoDiscover, SMTP, create all your certificates, specify your firewall rules, and then run hybrid. And typically where we would see most of the issues is around the publishing of all the CAS URLs. But like I say, I've got a slide and essentially a link that will show you how and what you need to do in order to publish hybrid and all the URLs that you require. Okay. So this is just an example of building out the where we would run the migration tool from. So it looks like I can run as well, Josh, for the minute. So did you see that? Has that built out the slide, or what can you see there, Josh? Can you just see the text on the left, or can you see the image on the right?
I don't think it built it out. Now it's starting to work.
Okay, cool.
Just so this click.
Yeah. Okay, no worries. So yeah, on here, this is just showing us where we would access the migration tool from. So from the right in the top right-hand corner, you can see admin. There's a little drop-down list from there. You would select Exchange. Then from the Exchange admin, we can access the recipients and migration. And then we click on the little plus button, and that would then give us the option of migrating to Office 365. And then it would give us another option that says, do you want to do a IMAP cutover staged or a mailbox move? And that remote mailbox move would essentially be the hybrid migration. Okay, Josh. Sorry, did that move? I can still see slide 24.
Yeah, we're on the migration tools.
Okay, right, yeah. So as we said, we can use the Exchange Admin Center, or we can use PowerShell. So just an example of one of the PowerShell commands. So there's the new move request, and you essentially enter the remote host. So the EWS endpoint, in this example, mail.company.com, enter your remote credentials, enter the target delivery domain, so the tenant.mail.onmicrosoft.com, which we mentioned earlier when we were doing the Outlook client AutoDiscover. So there's some other commandlets down the right-hand side. Some of those commandlets, such as suspend move, are available when you've got on-premise mailboxes that are on Exchange 2010. So some of those won't work with Exchange 2003, for example. Okay.
Go ahead.
Yes, yeah, please.
So the hybrid considerations.
Okay, that seems to be turning over for me, but never mind, as long as everybody else can see that slide. So the hybrid considerations. So making sure that the service address has been added. So what happens is when we run the hybrid configuration wizard, basically a secondary address is added to all of your accounts, and that secondary address is what we use to be able to migrate the mailbox. So if you do not have that secondary account added in your recipient policy, for one reason or other, i.e. you may have taken that person out of that particular recipient policy, then that migration would fail. So it's worth just doing some spot checks just to make sure that the mailboxes that you want to migrate have been added with a tenant name.mail.onmicrosoft.com, which is the service address space. Also, it could be an opportunity to remove some of the old proxy addresses. As we said, you can register the domain names in Office 365, or if it's some old proxy addresses that are not actually used from an SNMP perspective, then it's an opportunity to maybe tidy some of those up on-prem before you move those mailboxes to Office 365. We need to ensure that the UPN is federated with the tenant, so if we want to do things like single sign-on, for example. There are some registry keys that can be added to suppress some of the AutoDiscover warnings to say that your client is now redirecting to Office 365. When we do some hybrid migrations, any messages that are larger than 25 meg, that mailbox would fail completely unless you run some specific switches, and some of those switches are things like a large item switch, and you can specify some bad items as well. So as part of the command line shell command, you can specify that you want to migrate messages that would be larger than 25 meg. What that essentially means is the mailbox migration won't fail, but if that mailbox moves to Office 365, then you wouldn't be able to do anything with that particular item. We're on slide 26 there, Josh.
Yeah.
Yeah, can we just drop back one actually?
To 25?
Oh, sorry. No, I think we need to be one forward actually. Let me just double check, sorry.
Yeah, hybrid considerations.
Yeah, okay, so I would just, so that one, that's fine, yeah. So we also need to make sure that the Exchange server has internet access as well. So we can do that by specifying the Exchange server web proxy setting and specify the proxy server. Because when we run the hybrid configuration wizard, it'll essentially use the system account, and sometimes that doesn't pick up the proxy addresses that have been set on those servers. So it will use the Exchange proxy address, so sometimes we may need to run that. It's not always required, but it just depends on the server configuration. Also, we need to specify the certificates and install those certificates again for that TLS, and then ensure that there's no third-party devices sitting between on-premise and Office 365, otherwise we break that message fidelity. Yeah, Josh, if we could just drop back a slide, sorry, to the hybrid considerations with flood mitigation on, because I just want to make sure we cover that one.
Okay, which slide number is that?
I think it's 26.
Yep.
Yeah, so the flood mitigation one is something we've come across before. There is an article on the community site, and essentially what that does is when we configure flood mitigation, when we do a mailbox move to Office 365, the Office 365 IPs or servers obviously try and connect in to the Exchange organization to be able to move the mailbox content up to Office 365. If you haven't configured flood mitigation, on TMG, for example, then it thinks that there's a denial of service coming from those IP addresses, so it essentially blocks or stops those IP addresses from being able to do what they need to do, and those sessions from connecting and migrating that data. So we've seen migrations take hours and hours when really they should be completed in 20 or 30 minutes. So by enabling or configuring the flood mitigation piece, that massively improves obviously the mailbox moves, and you would see things like transient errors in the logs. So it's worth checking out that article, and also the last article on there, which is ensure that hybrid configuration wizard, so ensure there's no pre-authentication for EWS and AutoDiscover. So we don't want any devices, i.e. TMG for example, prompting for authentication. The authentication should be passed through straight back to the Exchange servers, which is where the Exchange migration tools will try and connect to. So we can test that by connecting to the URLs and ensuring that we resolve the XML file, for example, for AutoDiscover. But essentially, if you go to that article there, it will tell you what URLs and how to configure the hybrid configuration wizard. Sorry, how to configure your TMG server, for example, but you can obviously tweak that depending on what you're publishing your internet services using. But essentially, I'll tell you sort of a walkthrough guide of how you configure that. Okay, can we just move to slide 28, please?
Yep, go ahead.
Cool. So there's also just some logging. So we've had some improved logging. So essentially it's easy to read. There's also some commands in there that were not in 2010, and have now been converted to plain text in the log file. So it makes it easier for us to be able to copy and paste some of the commands, and you can run some of those commands yourself if something's failing, and you can run those in PowerShell for testing purposes essentially. As we said, we can test AutoDiscover endpoints, so make sure there's no pre-auth We can test the AutoDiscover DNS records, and we can use things like the Exchange Connectivity Analyzer to test that you can, essentially, your migrations will migrate successfully. The next slide, Josh, I think that's pretty much it really. It's just the some additional resources. So obviously there's the blogs, TechNet articles, and then just the next slide, Josh.
Sure.
And then just some of the tools that we can use as well. So there is a new PST capture tool, PST version 2, which has recently been released. So that's basically that. I guess we can open that up now to questions.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel. Great presentation.